Well, hello. Here we are with a screencast to introduce the very basics of HTML and CSS, hypertext markup language, and cascading style sheets. So let's have a look and see what we've got on the screen. For a start, I'm using an application called Atom, which is a free text editor created by the owners of GitHub. You can download this for free, and it's a very good application, very simple to use. You can see that actually once we have the text, in this case index.html, which is effectively my home page for my site, you'll see that the markup here in the middle is color coded so that it makes it easier for us to read. The colors have no difference at all on, of course, the way that the text is displayed on a web page, but that's just to help us visualize what we have in terms of the markup. Okay, so on the left hand side is the project. We have the index.html, as you can see, it's open at the moment, and we also have a style sheet called styles.css, which, as you can probably guess, is linked via this line here within the head tag. So let me just explain a little bit about HTML before we go any further. So HTML, markup language, and as you can see, we have an opening HTML tag, which is then subsequently at the very end of all the content closed with a /HTML. All tags need to be opened and closed in this way. So you have here, we have the children of HTML, two siblings. One is called head, which I've highlighted here, and the other is called body. And then, of course, within those tags are further tags, so it's nested inside. We have the title tag, which is just displaying the title of my page. And then we have the body, within which is the content of the page. So all content displayed on the page is therefore within the body tag. So you can see I've got the Shakespeare play, and then over on the right hand side I've got like a simulation of a web browser showing the content. So whatever I change in the content is therefore changed over on the web browser. So let's now have a look at the syntax for the style sheet language called cascading style sheets. Okay, so these simple, this is very simple at the moment. We simply have the body being the parent of all of the content on the page. And as you can see, this is the element or selector name, the element that's on the page. Every web page, of course, has a body. And then we are going to define what the attributes, the style attributes of this particular part of the web site or web page is then defined within the curly brackets. So as you can see, we have an opening and closing bracket like this. So anything within those two brackets will define certain styles within the body. So for example, one might be that we decide that we want to change or define the font family that we're planning to use, because as you can see at the moment it's just the default serif font. So I'm going to change this to a sans serif font like this, and then I simply save this, and as you can see this is now changed to whatever my browser has selected as a standard sans serif font. Now before I go any further, I'll just explain a little bit more about the font family rule, because normally what we'd actually do is to put a range of fonts in here, presuming that the web browser that the user is using has those fonts available to them. So for example, with a sans serif font, we might want to use, for example, Arial as a possibility. If the user hasn't got Arial, then we might want to use something like Helvetica as another option. So basically the way this works is that all of the fonts are listed in order until the final one, which is sans serif, is provided just in case the user has none of these fonts. Now there are quite a lot more detail that we can talk to you about fonts. We won't dwell on that for the moment, but suffice it to say that that's the basic standard system. Let's just change this again. Let's do something different here, and as you can see, we can of course use a different type of font. We can use, for example, a monospace font. And now that, as you can see, is more like a sort of typewriter style. Now this is H1, what we're seeing at the moment. Let's go back to our index and just to remind ourselves of what's within that body. We simply have a heading level 1. Let's supposing that we want to put in another tag, a heading, a subheading. We can use H2, and this time it's going to say something else. We might as well get the text correct, and then of course we close the tag like this. So you can see immediately that we have two things on the screen, and of course don't forget that the H2 will naturally be smaller than the H1 by default. We can of course change this. Let's do something else here and just take that out there so that we've got something a little bit more sensible. Go back to our styles. Let's actually change this now to a sans serif. Let's use something like Georgia, which is a little bit more friendly. Okay, and then we can say with H1 we might want to change the color of this. So let's make that red, and the color of H2 will be blue, for example. Save this, and you can see that we've immediately changed it on the page. So you can see that you can define each element individually. But you have to remember the cascade, what is called the cascade, because if we define something within the body for the text, for example, so if in the body I say color purple, I mean obviously we can put more specific colors in here, you'll see that that's not going to make any difference to this because we've already defined these later on in the list. So this is read sequentially. So after the color purple has been defined, we've actually defined H1 as red and H2 as blue. Okay, but now let's go back to the home page and put some text in here. Now I'm not obviously going to spend any time typing text, so we need to now use the paragraph tag, and I'm going to use the lorem. I just basically put some lorem ipsum text in there, and then I'm going to close that paragraph. So we have a paragraph of text. Now you can see that the text in the paragraph is purple. The reason for that is that if we go back to our style definition, you see that the whole body has been made into purple, whereas that definition has been overridden by H1 having the colour red and H2 having the colour blue. Now if I take this out, let me just for example take that out of there by just using this technique here, which just temporarily removes it. Save it. You can see that the text of the play, or my play, the heading 1, is now set to the default as defined by my body as being the colour purple. Now there are lots of other things of course that we can do. We haven't at the moment defined anything about the paragraphs, but we can do that. We can just simply write P for paragraph and then our curly brackets in here, and then we can do something like change the font of that. So let's actually say that we want the font family to be the serif font. So we won't put in any names at this stage, but you'll see that we've now got actually I'm going to change that because it doesn't make a lot of difference. Let's actually change that into a sans serif font. And you'll see that we've now got the paragraph in a sans serif font. We can also change the size of the font So let's actually say that we want the size of the font to be, now we aren't going to spend too much time on this, but we need to understand units of measure within CSS, and there are quite a lot of them. We can define it as a pixel unit, or we can define it as a proportion of the default. So the default size of this font would be 1 EM. So if I actually put that in, let's just try that. That shouldn't make any difference. But if we say that we want a fraction of that, so let's say we say 0.9 of an EM and save that, then you can see that this has changed. We can also define the leading, or you understand the leading, of course, but the leading is not specified in that way. We actually say line height. So line height is normally 1, but I'm going to widen it out a little bit and say 1.2. Now this is the way that we normally use line height. We don't have to have a unit because it's proportional to the font size itself. Okay, so that's, as you could see, that spaced it out a little bit, maybe not enough to help you understand. Let's just save that again. And you can see that we've now expanded the leading or the line height to be much more, probably too much in this particular case, so I'll just bring that down once more. Okay, now you'll see also that there is space between heading 1 and heading 2 and then the paragraph. These are what are known as the margins, and there are margins by default within the HTML CSS combination here. Those default settings are something that we can either just leave as they are or we can override them. So for example, let's just go back to our index and actually put in another paragraph of text. Let's do it like this again, and then again we finish that with our closing tag. So we now have 2 paragraphs of text like this, and you can see that there is a space between the paragraphs, which of course is exactly what we want. It's just also worth pointing out that space outside of the tags does not make any difference to the way the page is delivered on the browser. So for example, if I put my cursor just in here after that closing paragraph and put some space in, makes absolutely no difference. So space within the code is not actually going to make any difference, unless of course we specifically say that we want that space, but that's another story for another day. What I wanted to do, however, was once we've got these 2 paragraphs in here, is just to show you how we might change the margins. So margins are defined in this way. So margins are around the content. So you could have a margin of, say, let's say, for example, do something a little bit more exaggerated, 16 pixels, for example. And you can see that we've put a margin to the left as well as top and bottom. Let's actually do that even more. Okay, so a margin defined like this is actually saying margins all the way around the 4 sides. If we, however, want to just define the margin at the top and at the bottom and not at the right and the left, then what we do is to write it like this. So we can actually say margin like that. I should put in one too many semicolons there, but now you can see we've got a margin in between, but we haven't got a margin on the left and the right, because it's basically what you see here is effectively a shortcut for writing this. Let me make sure I get this right. I don't know why I've got that in there. Okay, so there we are. So 20 pixels at the top, 0 on the right, 20 pixels at the bottom, 0 on the left. Okay, so this of course is something that I can then control individually. If I don't want anything at the top, but I do want something at the bottom, then I can put again, I can change this to 20 pixels at the bottom, like this. I beg your pardon, on the left. That's what I meant. Okay, so we've got 20 pixels on the left, we've got 20 pixels on the top, we've got no margin on the right. So this is not pushing it over from the right. Now there are various other things that we can do. Let's just actually, so that we can see the content much more clearly, see the block of content that we've got for these paragraphs, by temporarily putting in a border of 1 pixel, solid rather than, of course, dotted, in a color, let's say red for the moment. Okay, so this is, as you can see, the content. It's just defining those blocks of content. So a paragraph is block level content. Let's put that back to 0 because I don't really think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so you can see that the content within the box goes right to the very edge of the top of the box. So the margin is around the outside of the box. In this case, the paragraph. However, there's also something else, which is the padding within the box. So padding, again, is defined in a very similar way. So if we just say padding of, say, 20 pixels, you will see that we've put padding inside the box. Okay, so the box is defined as the edge outside, and then we have inside it the padding. So outside the box is margin, inside the box is the padding. Okay, let me now talk a little bit more about the way that the text is on within the HTML here, and just show you that we actually have these various different elements. Now, H1, H2, and P for paragraph, they're all what we call block level elements because they sit on their own line. So they're displayed before and after with space. And in a way, that line around the paragraphs just demonstrates that even more clearly. However, sometimes there are different types of content that might be defined as inline. So let's say, for example, we've got a word or a set of words in here that we want to make bold or italicized. So let's just look at this here. Now, what we can do is to put some tag around that content. And we can do it in a number of different ways, but let's start off by just doing something very, very simple and put a bold tag around this content. And as you can see, that's now in bold over on my simulated browser. Another thing that we might want to, let's leave that where it is, and we'll now do something different here and use italic, which is defined with the I. Okay, so now you see we have some italicized text. If we want to use some other type of tag inline, then we generally use this form. We put a span tag around the content, spelt like this. And as you can see, that's made no difference at all to the design or the style of the text. But what we need to do is to define something in our CSS that defines what that span is going to look like. Now, I'm going to leave it like that for the moment, but you'll see how clever this will be. Let's go to the styles again. And what we need to do is to say, okay, the selector, which is called span, if I could only spell it correctly, I beg your pardon. Okay, we are now going to say what that will look like. So let's say, for example, that we might want to have a border at the bottom of this in 2 pixels, solid green. Okay, so as you can see, that's now appeared here because we've defined it over here in the CSS. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, though, before we go any further, that we this is a very generic tag, if you like. So span tags might be happening all over your site, and so therefore what you need to do is to define this a little bit more with a little bit more fine grain, as it were. So let's go back here to our HTML, and we are now going to take this span tag and apply a label to it, which we call a class. So we're going to give this a class name, and we're going to call this definition, because maybe it's something important in the text or something like that. And again, you see that doesn't really make any difference over here, but what we've actually got here is a span tag given a name of definition. We could have a different span tag. Let's say let's move down to this place here, and we're going to have another span tag, this time with a different class name of translation or something like that, just for the sake of argument. That's our span tag, and now our closing span is here. Okay, so again, you can see at the moment they're both underlined in green because we've given the definition for our style for all span tags to be like that. But that's not what we want to do. What we actually want to do is to define our specific class name, and we do that by putting simply a dot, because then it's going to be a class. Okay, so the dot represents the class selector. So I'm going to give this the name of definition, I think I called it. Save that, and you'll see that we've got that up here, but not down here. So now what we want to do is to define the other span tag, which I think was called translation. Curly brackets, and this time we're going to give a border bottom 1 pixel solid, I don't know, what do you think, orange. Okay, I don't know whether you can see that, it's quite light, quite faint. Let's make that into a 2 pixel, just to make it clear. At the moment we've got a general definition for all paragraphs, as you can see, the size and so forth. That's defining all paragraphs at this stage within that block. But however, if we now go back to our HTML and give the first paragraph a different class name, let's call it intro, and then go back to our CSS. Obviously that hasn't made any difference so far, but after, the important thing is after we've defined the paragraph, the general paragraph, we then define the class, or the paragraph that is given the class name of intro. And for this we want the font size to be larger, so I'm going to say 1.5 EM. Far too big, so let's actually go back to 1.1. Okay, so you can see that we've now changed this particular font, or this particular size of font, just only for the intro. Now it's very important that you understand the order in which this is read, because of course the generic style for the paragraphs, and then after that the intro. Okay, thank you.